Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. The Indian government and its supporters, they continue to say that the situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir is completely normal. And they say this despite the fact that it is going to be almost a month now. In fact, on Thursday, it will be a month since the region remains under a blanket communication blackout, with strict curfews curtailing civilians' movement to and from schools, mosques, workplaces. There are reports from international news channels, reporters on the ground speak of the dire situation, and especially in South Kashmir. I'll just refer to one particular report that caused a lot of uproar in the Indian government, and that was the BBC report from 10th August, just 5 days after the revocation of Article 370 that essentially stripped Indian-occupied Kashmir of its special status. So 5 days after the revocation of this article, BBC showed a report where it showed thousands of civilians, protesters, showing up on the streets of Srinagar after Friday prayers. The police, they opened fire and they used tear gas to disperse the crowd, something that the Indian government was very quick to deny. First, it denied the protests even took place. Later, when the BBC stood by a stance and they denied any use, the Indian government denied that they used any guns, but you can hear it loud and clear, the sound of gunshots. Similarly, there are countless other incidents where the media, whether local or international, reporting with great difficulty in Indian-occupied Kashmir, showing a completely different situation from what the BJP-led government is saying. So we'll be talking to our guests about the problem of reporting from the region, the question of how fake news is being filtered and how complete denial of actual news is perpetuating the humanitarian crisis in the region. And hopefully from that, what we will also glean from our experts is whether we can look at Indian-occupied Kashmir from the history of colonization. So first, without further ado, let me introduce who will be joining us. From our Lahore studios, we have former Ambassador, Mr. Haroon Shaukat. Thank you for taking out the time and coming and speaking to us. Also, we have Ms. Zainab Ramahi, who is a decolonial activist. She is joining us from Ontario, Canada. And we have Mr. Shabir Hussain, senior journalist and analyst, editor of the Kashmir Newsline. He is joining us from Delhi. So welcome to all of you. And thank you for taking out the time. So I'm going to start with you here, Mr. Shaukat. If we can just essentially highlight, in this current scenario, it's almost been a month now. And Pakistan continues to push this diplomacy forward that there's a humanitarian crisis on the ground. The world needs to wake up and do something. Do you feel that we are covering all grounds here, or something is not being highlighted at this time?
Well, I think the government is actually pursuing a very balanced policy. I think they're covering the diplomatic front very well. But there is probably need to focus on a few areas. For example, we need to determine the areas which raise the political cost of the Indian illegal actions in Kashmir. We need to sensitize more the international public opinion, the international media, and we need to indulge more in what is called diaspora diplomacy. Yesterday, there was a big manifestation in London, and I think more than 15,000 Kashmiris rallied on the streets of London, which was noticed by the world at large. The Kashmir is one of the oldest disputes in the world, along with Palestine and Palestinian issue, the Cyprus issue, and a few others. But the Kashmiri people have a right which is recognized by the United Nations Security Council, right to self-determination. It is their own future. And by revoking Article 370, India has added to the continuing illegality of their occupation of the Kashmir Valley. So I think this is a time then that the struggle of the Kashmiris is a valiant struggle. They have actually shown the world that they can stand up to a military jackboot of the Indian, it's more than maybe 700,000 troops in the Kashmir Valley. We need to stand with them. We need to be their voice, and we need to sensitize the whole world that's time to wake up.
Which is essentially what is going on here. But what gets lost here, and I want to ask you this, Mr. Hussain, you've been reporting from the ground. You yourself are a Kashmiri from Srinagar. Tell us a little about the kind of basic difficulties that this past month has posed on the journalists trying to report from the region.
Thank you, Ayza. This is, as we all know, this is an extremely tough, very stern blackout on communication. And I think some of the local journalists are doing an incredible job. and somehow managing to filter the news out of Kashmir, risking their limb and life. It's not easy. They have to actually, after every 15 or 20 minutes when they are moving around in Srinagar, they have to confront these very aggressive security forces and police and military and argue with them. And, they are at risk, and it's a very tough job, very
Mr.
difficult
Hussain,
job.
there are also reports that journalists who fly in and out of Srinagar, lots of them we've spoken to originating from New Delhi, they talk about how their footage, their photographs, they're forcibly erased from their cameras.
Yes, absolutely. There have been many cases. Around 15 days back, one such episode happened in Eidgah area when photographers were caught and their mobiles were snatched, and they were forced to unlock their mobiles, and the entire footage, videos and photographs and other content was deleted. And this is a regular thing, and yet somehow they manage. What they do is they skirt these security bunkers, move around to back alleys and just hide these mobiles, and somehow they manage. And when some Kashmiris fly out of Srinagar, and they give them these USB sticks and hard disks, or sometimes fly out of Kashmir themselves, and that's how the world that we are able to see what's going on there. It's very tough. It's not easy.
It's not easy. And we hear a lot of reports on, especially journalists from Srinagar writing about how they had waited until they could file their story in these media facilitation centers. Give us an idea of who is hosting these.
Yes. There is one media facilitation center, and it has just 5 computers, and the speed of the internet has been drastically reduced. So it's just a token kind of a thing, and just to give the world an impression that, look, despite this situation, we are managing, we are ensuring that the media is working. It's all a hogwash. I mean, whatever little footage and content we have been able to see in the last month is all because of great efforts, incredible efforts of local journalists. And then it's not the Indian media that carries it, it's the international media, and you know how the Indian media operates, and it's only an extension of this BJP government. So they're blatantly lying on this.
So stay with us there, Mr. Hussain. I want to bring Ms. Ramahi about your expertise. You've worked extensively on how property law and political conflict, how this is shaping and affecting the rights of Kashmiris here. When you see what is unfolding in the past month alone on Kashmiris in Jammu and Kashmir, what is your understanding of the very basis of why this article was revoked?
I think this 100% ushers in a very threatening new era in the relationship between Kashmir and India. I think Kashmir has always stood at a colonial, in a colonial relationship with India. You see that in the way that it for decades has used the rhetoric of Kashmir being an integral part of the union, but then failing to extend basic rights and privileges to the rest of the population, or taking them away writ large under acts like AFSPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and other laws that seek to really deprive Kashmiris of their ability to resist. And as our other guests have pointed out, they have successfully been resisting for decades in spite of those efforts. But this definitely heralds in a new change. This opens the door for actual settlement of Hindus in Muslim-majority Kashmir, which, as we know and is much talked about, the UN has pledged to hold free and fair referenda in Kashmir to settle the issue since the 50s. And were there to be a major demographic shift in the region, of course, the results of that referendum would be illegitimate in the eyes of the international community and under international law. But I think it's pretty clear that this is a direction that we're headed in.
So would you say then, from your research, especially on what has been happening in Kashmir for the past 7 decades, especially the past 3 have been especially hard on Kashmiri, that this is a classic case of colonization?
Absolutely. I mean, without a doubt, I think people may get tripped up because of the history of British rule in the subcontinent and really looking at this as a post-colonial state. But I think we really need to look at the trends of ethno-nationalism that have become global and definitely examine the actual relationship, the realities of the relationship between India and Kashmir at this point, and recognize it for what it is, and that is a colonial relationship.
It's a colonial relationship. Stay with us there, Mr. Ramahi. Coming back to you, Mr. Shaukat, while this colonization of sorts is taking place under huge humanitarian violations of Geneva Conventions or any law, international law you want to look at, the fact is that we've seen Prime Minister Imran Khan, we've seen the Foreign Minister of Pakistan, we've seen them continuously, tirelessly bring this issue up on every forum, as well as speaking to international leaders. Now, the problem is that even when we see statements coming in from, say, the UK, where they say, well, yes, Kashmir is a bilateral issue, but when they say that the issue of the human rights is an international issue, is that just nearly enough that we need to provoke a debate that will finally bring what is happening in IOK to a standstill?
Well, the resolutions of the Security Council in Kashmir are now, nearly 70 years old, and they remain as valid as they were. But to mobilize the international community into honoring the pledges they have made through these resolutions, that is of a plebiscite,
right,
so that the Kashmiris decide whether they want to accede to Pakistan or to India. They were the only two choices given to them under those resolutions. I think there is the geopolitics of today which takes over other considerations. Many of your very friendly countries and brotherly countries, when you speak to them bilaterally, they will agree with you 100%. But they don't want to be put into a situation where they have to make a choice.
Because at the end of the day, it's all economics, right? Because we're talking about an economy, India's economy, which is bordering around $2 trillion. So obviously, whoever's going to take on India is looking towards losing a lot of income.
But remember, this is a struggle for the freedom of the Kashmiri people. And the Kashmiri people are really sticking it out, and they are showing a courage that's unprecedented in this part of the world. Look back on your own independence. There was a time when it was said that sun never sets in the British Empire.
Right.
And then Pakistan, India got liberated from the colonial, grip of the British.
Okay.
So the time for the Kashmiris will come. It may take time, but the time for the Kashmiri freedom will come. Have faith in this. And as Pakistanis, as true supporters and friends of Kashmiris, we have to stand with them all the time.
All the time. Okay, so stay there, Mr. Shaukat. So coming back to you, Mr. Shabir Hussain, you heard what Mr. Shaukat had to say here, that quoting historical texts where the time of freedom for Kashmiris will come. But at this point right now, this juncture, 2019, what we are seeing with the BJP-led government twice in a row is in power. And it's not just what is happening in Indian-occupied Kashmir. It seems across the board in India, what we're seeing is the subjugation of minorities taking place. From a reporting point of view, the sentiment on the ground, what can you tell us? Is there as big a change?
Absolutely, absolutely. People, you see, Kashmiris have been fighting religiously and with great commitment as far as their right to their independence movement is concerned. But with the emergence of BJP and Hindutva forces in India, and with Modi coming in power, it has gained more momentum. Kashmiris have stronger and greater resolve now, and they are fighting with more zeal and more gusto after the emergence of the RSS as an all-pervading organization in India that's anti-minority, anti-Muslim, anti-Christian, anti-everything that it does not subscribe to.
Okay. Thank you so much. Ms. Mahami, we were talking about the aspect of colonization here. And what is it, in your understanding, that when a population that has already been very vocal in voicing, has been very vocal in their sentiments toward the government, and is further subjugated like they are right now, what is the reaction expected from them? Like, does the government manage to suppress them, eventually break their backs?
I think that's an excellent question. It's something that it's our responsibility as members of the international community to pay grave attention to. The information that Kashmiris themselves in the valley, despite incredibly valiant reporting and attempts to spread information in spite of the communications blackout there, it is limited. So we don't necessarily even know the full extent of the information that Kashmiris who are not able to travel to Delhi, what they do know about what is going on. And I think that control of information is another strategy by the Indian government. It's another tactic to control the restive population right there. But they can't do that forever, and people will understand the extent of this latest maneuver sooner or later. And of course, Kashmiris have known that this is coming for a long time. On August 5th, we all woke up to really significant news, but I would say that attempts to both abrogate 370 and erode Article 35A, which of course had long protected the region from settlement by Indians, these have been in the works for a long time. The BJP has made its intentions vis-a-vis Kashmir incredibly clear, and as you said, this is Modi's second term in government, and more than that, for a long time in terms of the extension of constitutional orders or presidential orders from the center to Kashmir, again, since the 50s, since the United Nations reaffirmed the right of Kashmiris' self-determination. And, on one side, India committed to that as well, back when the issue first begun post-partition. Still, they have made steady attempts to erode the protections that are provided by Article 370. So this will come as no surprise. And yes, I've been to the region many times, and I've seen the strength and the energy with which Kashmiris resist. But, at the end of the day, we are often, start talking about political or economic rights, even when we are removed from the situation, when at the end of the day, people want to ensure that their children are not going to be picked up and taken away by security forces on their way to school, that there's access to healthcare and education. Right now, none of that is going on. And so it's our responsibility, I think, in the international community to put that pressure on the Indian government so that Kashmiris, can voice their resistance in the way that is legitimate for all struggles for self-determination around the world.
Also, I want to bring here the fact that today we're just hearing of this news where Maharashtra's tourism minister has announced that we've already given a token payment, that we are buying land to develop 2 resorts in Indian-occupied Kashmir here. And now this is, of course, happening at a time where there's already so much discontent across the people of Kashmir over the Article 370 because they believe that it basically breaks down the demographics, which was once a Muslim-dominated region, now becomes easy for anybody from anywhere in India, irrespective of their religion, to buy land.
Indeed. And, this wasn't that article that prevented Indians from buying land in Kashmir was not simply, something nice that was included as, some sort of benefit for the Kashmiris. This is actually just directly in compliance with Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Conventions, which prohibits an occupying force from transferring their population to the occupied area. Of course, we've seen that violated in other places in the world. Again, you have the mass settlements. A new slate of settlements were announced in the West Bank, for example. That is illegal under international law, and regardless of whether or not India was a contracting party to that initial agreement, it's considered customary international law, and I think it's a good basis upon which to hold the Indian government responsible.
Right. Stay with us there. Let me come back to you, Mr. While this is also unfolding in terms of land being purchased already, the real question remains is that while this is still the most militarized zone in the world, we've got 1 million plus Indian troops manning every nook and cranny across Kashmir. And then at the same time, we see the huge sort of the Indian government's resistance to having any UN observers on the ground. What does this translate to for you? I mean, like, how do you take this? Why do they deny them access?
Well, they have removed the office of Anmol Gip long time ago from Srinagar, while we have them on our side. Anmol Gip nonetheless reports periodically to the Security Council and to the UN Secretary General. The important thing is that you have to keep moving on several parallel tracks. You have to keep informing the Security Council President. You have to keep informing the UN Secretary General through letters by the Foreign Minister at the highest levels, or whatever is unfolding, whatever is happening in Kashmir. Those letters are circulated amongst all members of the Security Council. You have to also focus equally on organizations like European Union, which matter a lot for the Indians. You have to focus hugely on Commission on Human Rights. You have to also keep in constant touch with international human rights NGOs. It's only when international community's pressure is built upon India that it will relent. You know, the lives of the Kashmiri people cannot go on like this. This is an open prison, you know.
Right.
And it has to come to an end. And the Indians are feeling the heat. The Indians have, they took this decision. They're feeling the heat.
But what makes you think that they are feeling the heat?
I think, if you look at the international press, I think this has been an unprecedented coverage in the international...
Right, but at the same time, we've seen world leaders turn around and basically agree with India that yes, this is a bilateral issue, except for China. Nobody seems to have done anything. In fact, Modi is getting humanitarian awards.
Because every country has some skeleton in their cupboards. There are similar situations. Don't forget that, I do not know if it is appropriate to say, but Russia annexed Crimea very recently and got away with it so far. So there are other countries where there are so-called separatist movement, but Kashmiri movement is not a separatist movement. It's a movement for the right to self-determination, to determine their own future. This is a legitimate struggle which is promised to them by the international community. So no force can keep a people against their will.
Right.
They can't keep them subjugated forever.
But the cost of which is a very high cost, and that's civilian life, and that's what we're seeing, because what little reports we do have, we know that 2,000 plus, anywhere from 2,000 to 11,000 people have been detained, and so many numbers that we can't confirm because of the blackout have died as a result of these protests and the fire from the police. Now, Ms. Ramahi, when we talk about Kashmir and how this has been going on for so long, is there a real fear in terms of the kind of world reaction we are seeing, the lack of reaction, I would like to say? Is there a fear that this is the next Palestine or the next Darfur? I mean, like, is there any future to the resolution of Kashmir's conflict?
It's really, disheartening to think that, it's the next Palestine. But I think that for those who have been involved in looking at the state of Kashmiri's human rights and its political future, even for a long time, there has been an acceptance that it already, it became the next Palestine, I think, quite a while ago. But, just as there are Palestinians, still living in Palestine and outside of it, agitating for their rights and continuing to resist the settler colonization perpetrated by Israel, Kashmiris absolutely will and can, do the same. I think what we haven't yet talked about in this discussion are Indians themselves and any potential pressure that they may be able to exert on the government that they elected. India touts itself, right, as the largest democracy in the world. Similarly, Israel describes itself as the only democracy in the Middle East. But time and again, I think we need to ask the question, for whom is that democracy? Who does the government actually serve? And I think that Indians should have a lot of reason to be very concerned about the rule of law in their own nation. These sort of legal maneuverings that their parliament went through in order to abrogate 370 really should shock the conscience of Indians themselves and sets a very bad precedent for the legitimacy of law and democracy within India. And so I know that there are some incredible voices coming from India or Indians abroad, standing in solidarity with Kashmiris. But I think there needs to be much more energy coming from Indians themselves.
But there's then a big concern there, Mr. Shaukat, especially, it's a very good point, we did miss out on that, whether the voices from within India, and there are quite a few, they're academics, they're journalists, they're scholars, they're even politicians who are speaking up. But what we're seeing in turn is them being picked up, being detained and being accused for defaming the government.
Because what this government is doing is against the spirit of what India claims to stand for, like democracy, human rights, and rule of law, etc. This Hindutva policy of RSS, which is imbibed in the policy of Prime Minister Modi's policies, this is actually contrary to whatever India has been claiming to be. Now, that is precisely what we need to do. What the image of India as the largest democracy, we must hit at that as a democracy which claims to be democratic. Look what they're doing in Kashmir, and equally.
I'm all for this. I completely understand what you're trying to say here, but the precedent that's been set by the world itself is not much happening there. I mean, we can look at Israel and Palestine. We can see what Russia is doing in Syria, what Turkey is doing in Syria. I mean, there's too many examples of what nations try to project themselves at, but because of their trade volume, it trumps any kind of humanitarian cause.
That carries its own weight. That is true. That is what is the real geopolitics of today's world. Countries look at their own national interest before they act. I think if you talk to any of these major powers privately, they will agree with you. They will recognize the legitimacy of the Kashmiri struggle. But nonetheless, you have seen the decolonization period in the 60s and earlier. The big empires dismantled. Many countries were unshackled from the grip of the colonial powers. And the Kashmiris have never been comfortable with India. Right. It's not about 370. It is their fundamental right. Their fundamental right to choose their own destiny has been denied to them.
Right.
They put all sorts of, gloss on it, that we have had state elections, this, that.
Right.
That's not what it's about. It's about their inalienable right to determine their own future.
I mean, talking about development funding and everything, it really doesn't, it comes to naught when the crisis in itself, when the people in itself have been suppressed to speak what they think. All right, thank you so much, Mr. Haroon Shaukat, and of course, Ms. Zainab Ramahi and Mr. Shabir Hussain for taking out the time to speak to us here on Newswire. Before we take a quick short break, let me just surprise you what the DG ISPR said in a presser today about Kashmir, talking about Prime Minister Modi's agenda, his ideology that he was following, and suppressing Kashmiri voice would just bring more attention to the plight of the Kashmiris across the world, which is pretty much what is happening now. And with that, we'll take a quick short break. We'll see you on the other side. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, the U.S. envoy to Afghanistan, Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, he said that the Taliban and the U.S. have reached a deal in principle to end America's longest war. But just a few hours later, the Taliban orchestrated a suicide bombing in the capital, Kabul, that killed at least 16 people and wounded over 100, almost all local civilians. So we will be talking to our guests about the efficacy, the purpose of this peace deal, even if it's in its draft version, which is being done with the Taliban, and whether the U.S. is cutting corners in its desperation to get out as fast as it can from Afghanistan. So let me introduce our panel. We have with us Mr. Hamdullah Hamdard, an analyst joining us from Kabul. Thank you for taking out the time, Mr. Hamdard. And also from Singapore, we have political analyst Mr. James Dorsey. Welcome to the show. Mr. Dorsey, if I just come to you straight off the bat here, especially what is unfolded in Kabul on Monday, the car bombing, and being significantly right outside a community where mostly foreigners and NGOs are housed, Taliban took responsibility for it. How do you see this ninth round concluding between the U.S. and the Taliban?
Well, I think there's little doubt that President Donald Trump wants out of Afghanistan prior to next year's U.S. presidential election. At the end of the day, on the one hand, he had promised no more wars, and on the other hand, he really has little to show until now in terms of foreign policy successes. And so a withdrawal from Afghanistan would be a success, even if that does not guarantee or even bode well for a process of peace within Afghanistan that will return the country to some degree of stability.
And when they spell out, when the U.S. envoy sort of loosely spells out what this draft deal would basically mean, what it would say, and he talks about how 8,600 troops will be left behind, the rest will be withdrawn in the next 4 months. How does this make you feel about what the U.S. has planned?
Well, look, in a sense, I think you've got a double bind here. One is the United States wants out, is going to, in the first phase, according to the draft agreement or the details that we know so far, going to withdraw about a third of its troops and eventually draw down to a few hundred who really are not going to make a major difference. The problem simply is that ultimately you need a U.S. withdrawal, but you need a U.S. withdrawal within the context of a very clear agreement between the parties that are fighting in Afghanistan itself. And what you right now have is an agreement between the United States and the Taliban with no involvement or barely any involvement directly in negotiations with the Taliban about the future of Afghanistan.
Right. Okay, so stay there with us, Mr. Dorsey. To you, Mr. Hamdard. Now, what we're also hearing from analysts at this point of time, and in fact for a while now, especially considering that now Mr. Khalilzad has come out and said, and President Donald Trump has also said in a recent interview to Fox News that I'm just looking to leave 8,600 troops in Afghanistan out of the 14,000 that are stationed here. Is there a real risk of a total civil war if Afghanistan's current plan that US has of withdrawal takes place?
I believe that if the negotiation is also done with the Afghan government and there is a trilateral agreement on the peace accord, we will not witness any civil war like we did in 1992 in Afghanistan. If the peace deal is not properly communicated with the Afghan government, between the Afghan government, Taliban, and the US, then of course we do see the risk of even a more fatal civil war in Afghanistan once again. But I'm sure this time Zalmay Khalilzad and Dr. Ashraf Ghani and the Taliban leader, they're all taking care of this peace accord very carefully. It's very obvious that Taliban are trying to gain more through this peace deal, and the Afghan government is trying the same. So we look forward for a win-win situation for all the parties.
Mr. Hamdard, to interrupt, but when you say that it is very obvious that the Taliban are trying to do as much as they can to win most or to reach most of their points in this agreement, what are you referring to? Are you referring to, by any chance, what we've seen in the past 3 days, these 3 major attacks?
See, the day before yesterday, in the evening at 9:46 p.m., there was a very huge explosion in Kabul on Green Village, where there is a guest house of the foreigners. And that killed so many civilians because the homes near that area are all not like cemented or they're not like villas, very strong homes. They're very poor people's homes, and they were all destroyed.
Taliban,
so many people were killed.
The Taliban said that they took...
They simply mean, Taliban took the responsibility for that, and they're trying to show that they're still strong and they can still attack in Kabul so that they can gain more during the peace deal, or they are showing their strength in war to the government of Afghanistan before starting the intra-Afghan peace talks, which will start in one of the European countries, I guess.
Right. Mr. Hamdard, that was exactly what I was hoping you would make here. And coming back to you, Mr. Dorsey, then it begs the question that if even the Taliban spokesman who came out and said that we understand peace talks are going on, but they must also understand that we are not weak. And if we enter into talks, we enter from a strong position. Now, this is coming at the 9th round, this escalation of violence here. A lot of analysts, especially from the US, are starting to wonder, Washington, D.C. has expressed concerns also, that is this the right way to go?
Well, it strikes me that it's very hard to have confidence in an agreement in which parties are not talking to each other directly and negotiating this. So, with other words, as long as the Taliban refuse to talk to the Afghan government, and the Afghan government is double-minded about talking to the Taliban, and therefore you're really talking to a third party that has interests of its own, there's no reason why you should believe that this is going to be stable. I think the other point here in terms of the attacks is that the Taliban, obviously, in this kind of an environment in which the Americans are not clearly saying you need to involve all parties directly around the table in this negotiation, that they already are operating from a position of strength. What the attacks do is clearly underline that, and also for any critics that there may be within the Taliban movement about talking to the Americans, demonstrates to them that this isn't costing us anything.
Well, see, this is the cost factor in itself really then makes one wonder that to date, what we know that the conflict, it's taken over 4,000 American military lives and civilian personnel, while another, I believe, 20,000 have been wounded, many suffering from life-changing injuries here. So it's costing Americans a lot of money. By some estimates, the American taxpayers are paying up to $1 trillion. So then we have the 2020 elections coming up, where President Trump has been campaigning that we are going to be stopping all these senseless wars. So it makes one wonder then, are they giving it their all at a time where there's already representation of how volatile the Taliban really are?
I think the problem here is the following. There's no doubt that this war has cost the Americans dearly, both in terms of money as well as in terms of blood. The issue here, though, shouldn't be cost as such, but really goes to the question of whether or not the whole strategy in Afghanistan, one that was primarily geared towards military victory rather than rebuilding and reconstruction of the country, whether that was a strategy that by definition was, one, not going to lead to a success, and two, be very costly with very little to show in return for it.
Okay. So, Mr. Hamdard, we've talked about how the third party that should be involved in these conversations has been forcibly kept out of it, and that is the Ashraf Ghani government. Now, the U.S., Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, he has presented the draft to President Ashraf Ghani, and whose spokesman then said that we'll take a few days to study it and get back on it. So, I mean, what does this translate into? Do they even have any options? Do we know what their sentiments are on this drawdown of troops?
Well, the first step of the peace negotiation was that Taliban would talk with Zalmay Khalilzad, special representative of the U.S. for the Afghan peace reconciliation. And the second stage of the peace talks is that the Afghan delegation will have to sit with the Afghan government that is representing the people of Afghanistan, and they will talk about the future steps or the upcoming steps of the peace deal and the what kind of the government will be there in Afghanistan in the future when the peace deal is implemented or agreed upon. So it was only the first step. And even in the first step, that is between the U.S. Special Representative and Taliban delegation, that will also have to be approved by the Afghan government, because the withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Afghanistan will definitely either adversely affect or it will affect the Afghan forces positively. It depends on the situations. So this definitely needs the agreement of the Afghan government whether the U.S. forces will have to withdraw within the time frame or not. If the Afghan government does not agree, the U.S. cannot agree by themselves only without having the agreement of the Afghan government. Here, the importance of the Afghan government's participation in this agreement is clear. And the second step will be the negotiation between the Taliban delegation and the Afghan government, and that will decide the future of Afghanistan. And what you pointed out before, whether there is the risk of the civil war in the future or not. It will also depend on the agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government and other political parties that are currently active in Afghanistan. So if we want to reduce the risk of the civil war, these three parties, the Afghan government, plus the Taliban, plus the US special representative in the US government, of course, they will have to very carefully go ahead on this peace deal with the Taliban and the Afghan, between the Taliban and the Afghan government. If not, then you're right, we may sense the risk of the civil war once again in Afghanistan.
Once again, that would create more problems, more lives would be lost. But we're running out of time. Mr. Dorsey, quickly want your comment on this. Is it even a good idea to go ahead with the presidential elections, considering they're expected at the end of the month? I know preparations are pretty much underway and complete for most parts, but considering what the Taliban has gone and said, that we will boycott the elections and have discouraged people from participating.
Well, the Taliban have always boycotted the elections. There's no reason why they should change their position on that now. Nonetheless, an election lends legitimacy if one assumes that it was free and fair, and we'll have to see that. So in that sense, I don't think elections are the issue. I think the real issue is here, the American goal in these negotiations is departure from Afghanistan. The American goal is not a solution to the Afghan problem that will be sustainable. And so you're negotiating a first phase in which that is the goal. And in a sense, to some degree, even if you have a second phase, ensuring a situation in which the Afghan government is going to be going into that negotiation in a weakened position.
But do you have faith that there is going to be a second phase?
I would not put my hand in fire for that. I'm sure that the Americans would like to see a second phase. And it probably, and we haven't seen the text of the draft agreement, but I would assume that some negotiation is part of the precondition for an American withdrawal.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dorsey and Mr. Hamdard, for taking out the time and speaking to us here on Newswire. We've come to the end of the program, but before we go, let me also mention that DG ISPR, in a presser today, speaking to the media, mentioned how peace in Afghanistan, the next step, was very important to Pakistan. The intra-Afghan dialogue was very important for peace in the region, and that Pakistan would stand and support in any way it can to bring peace in the region. And that's all from now. We will see you next week. Till then, goodbye.